Recently I read an Old Testament scholar, he's a theistic evolutionist named Peter Enns, and he stated this. He said, quote, "The Pentateuch was not authored of one whole cloth by a second millennium Moses, but is the end product of a complex literary process, written, oral, or both, that did not come to a close until the post-exilic period." This is something he wrote in The Evolution of Adam, what the Bible does and doesn't say about human origins. Now, he published that back in 2012, but he is, by the way, still writing, and he's calling for an extensive understanding of hermeneutics and a re-examination of Christian principles in the U.S., and some of his works, like The Sin of Certainty, and some of his articles in Huffington Post are really calling us to a place where we would view the Bible quite differently than, say, conservatives like I would. Ironically, he's absolutely certain his conclusions are facts. Now, his view actually is quite common, but is it correct? Is it irrefutable? I would suggest that, in contradistinction to modern journal articles and seminary lectures that affirm the position that Moses was not the author, that the case for Moses as the author of the Pentateuch is actually quite full, with evidence found within the biblical text, but also supported by a number of external considerations that are worth exploring. Internal testimony unquestionably affirms Mosaic authorship in many, many places. I mean, consider how should we understand the text when it says something like Deuteronomy 4:44, "Now this is the law which Moses set before the sons of Israel," or Numbers 1:1, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying." Now, there's a ton of these, many, many more. Clearly, the Torah position was that Moses was meeting with God, and these are things revealed from the Lord that he passes to Israel. That seems to be the forthright intent, and it's seen in comments like Numbers 9:23, where it says, "At the command of the Lord they camped, and at the command of the Lord they set out. They did what the Lord required, in accordance with the command of the Lord through Moses." Now, while that internal evidence is important, it does not stand alone. There are numerous additional reasons to uphold the view that the text was not the creation of others who were much later than Moses, but a presentation as his work. First, while it's true that some passages evidence an editorial touch, that is like the death of Moses portion at the end of Deuteronomy, the body of the Torah displays a remarkable consistency that suggests it was the work of a singular writer, and it challenges the notion of later deep editorial compilation. On the whole, the story is quite cohesive. It's not a string of just wisdom literature meme sayings that are kind of pieced together with some legal code. There's a compelling story behind what's going on. Not only that, but attempts to situate specific passages within centuries later editions falters under scrutiny. For example, the geographical details in these books often correspond to intimate firsthand knowledge of ancient Egypt and the Sinai wilderness, suggesting that the writer was personally familiar with those regions and that it was unlikely that the writers would be in a later period. Not only that, but much of the work is senseless if written long after, offering place names and comparisons to places the readers could not have known otherwise, offering no help to the reader at all. So it seems fair to ask, why compare dates and places in Canaan to places in Egypt for people who have never seen Egypt? Yet the Torah does this on a number of occasions, like Numbers 13:22, where it talks about Hebron being like Zoan. There are several of these. Now, second, the use of Egyptian terms in the Torah acts as linguistic evidence. In those writings, we can observe more than 50 words that directly relate to Egyptian words. And if you take away all the ones that are repeated in later Hebrew scripture, that's the highest number of any of the Hebrew scriptures, meaning there's more Egyptian in those texts than any other. That's certainly suggestive of a text that originated from a people that were bound to the Egyptians as they were reported to have been under the time of Moses. And it also suggests that there are people who are more familiar with Egyptian terminology. Third, the text specifically referred to several specific environmental factors that simply would not have been known by later generations and people unfamiliar with the territory that we're talking about. Now, as we noted, some details could only be supplied by someone who knew the places and could only really be meaningful to people who had some personal attachment to those places. In a number of places in the Torah, the flora, the fauna, the atmospheric references align with an Egyptian and geographical context in Sinai, but they don't fit comfortably within the framework of a Canaan-based later generation writing that the documentary hypothesis or the JEDP theory would call for. And this is the theory behind a lot of your modern writers. For instance, the geographical details in Numbers 33 assumed the author had a firsthand knowledge of those places, and he was referencing things in a way that would have had no meaning to people who had never been in the wilderness of Zin, the wilderness of Paran, the wilderness of Sin. In fact, the details were inane if written centuries later for readers that were wholly unfamiliar with those areas. Now, fourth, evidence from archaeology poses significant challenges to assumptions that are foundational to understanding and believing the documentary hypothesis. For example, artifact findings that align with the Pentateuch's historical claims frequently contradict the theory or challenge the theory that these texts were later fabrications. So there's evidence not only for literacy, but also that the name of Moses is known contemporary to even the earliest date of the Exodus event. I'm thinking of Dr. Douglas Petrovich's work in 2016, The World's Oldest Alphabet. And there he posits that the Hebrews, not the Phoenicians, invented the earliest alphabet. He attributed the writing of a group of Hebrew sojourners in Egypt at Lahun or Wadi al-Hol in the Sinai, nearby to Sarab al-Khadim and Wadi Nasid. He said that from the time of Joseph to Moses, using the early date for the Exodus from about 1850 down to, let's say, 1446, there are writings that can be found in the desert and can be reasonably well dated by epigraphic evidences that are presented. So he identified and translated inscriptions he feels were largely written by shepherds and miners. These confirm that Moses could have written the Torah in the Hebrew language and that at least some of the slave Israelites were likely to be able to read and write. And you can see a good cross-reference for that in Deuteronomy 6:9. Petrovich discovered the name of Moses was in one of the writings, as well as several other Old Testament names that have been never found outside the Bible until he was doing his work down in the Sinai region. One particular fragment is called Sinai 361. And it's actually in two fragments inscribed on a single stone that's been since broken. The inscription reads this way: "Our bound servitude had lingered. Moses then provoked astonishment. It is a year of astonishment because of the lady." Now, although Sinai 361 has not been firmly dated, and it's not actually sure what all the references are to, it's found among other inscriptions from the mines in Sarab al-Khadim, which is from the time of Thutmose III, who's a good candidate for Pharaoh who chased Moses out of Egypt, and Amenhotep II, a good candidate for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So the pottery dates the inscription to sometime around 1446 BC, and that's an acceptable way to assume a date in many excavations around the world. If you apply the same dating system that's used countless other places, you come up with something in the middle of the 15th century BCE. Sinai 361 refers to a year of astonishing events, and one of the persons that is named in the text is Moses. Now, the events described on the inscription fit a historical period, and the presence of the name of Moses in the middle 15th century BCE on an inscription allow us to openly question those who conclude that the Torah had to have been composed in the post-exilic period on linguistic grounds. Petrovich's translation should be fairly tested, but if found reliable, it adds strong linguistic evidence. There's more, though. We often refer to the dates of inserted priestly texts in scholarly writings. The work of scholars has been deeply impacted by the documentary hypothesis, and that was codified by Julius Wellhausen, who lived in 1844 to 1918. In the case of priestly passages, he firmly believed that passages that were like number 6 benediction were an addition by a priestly school a source he noted was post-exilic after the exile in Babylon, and he viewed it as a product of ritualistic and hierarchical concerns. Frankly, he was wrong. In the Ketephenome excavation in Jerusalem in 1979, the challenge came from an artifact that was found by Dr. Gabriel Barkay, who later became my professor of archaeology. He excavated a tomb along the Hinnom Valley and unearthed 2 silver scrolls, 99% content silver, 1% copper. These scrolls were worn probably as amulets around someone's neck and were buried with them. Unrolled, they disclosed Paleo-Hebrew characters of the Aaronic blessing that is found in Numbers 6, 24-26, and what appears to be on some of the lines that may have come from Deuteronomy 7 as well. Now listen to what it says. It says, "The Lord, or Yahweh, bless you and keep you. The Lord, Yahweh, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord, Yahweh, lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." Now, the 7th century BCE date, the 600s BCE date for the scrolls, makes them the earliest known artifact from the ancient world that documents part of the Old Testament. So outside of scrolls of the Old Testament, this would be corroborating evidence in jewelry. Now, some scholars originally tried to date the scrolls to the intertestamental period, somewhere, let's say, around 400 BCE, but after detailed high-resolution images were taken of the scrolls, they concluded that it belonged to the pre-exile, the time before Babylon came. So paleographic scholars confirmed a date that was near the end of the 7th century BCE, and that corresponded with the strata or the stratigraphy inside the tomb. So that squarely pointed to the presence of an overt, formulaic, priestly blessing from pre-exile time, and the text that would have been placed by any JEDP following scholar to post-exile prior to that was absolutely, now we've got it in writing, we've got it in an actual artifact. So we can archaeologically conclude that a physical text of Numbers 6 existed by the end of the 7th century BC, and that matches what our biblical text said in content and absolutely voids any automatic assumption that such a text had to be part of a priestly edition that wasn't added until after the exile. You cannot make such a statement because the artifact challenges you. Clearly, it was already a known priestly text. Based on the Bible, we can see it was faithfully transmitted because it matches the biblical record. And we can also see it appears to be already appreciated or revered before the Babylonians took Judah into exile. Now, that by itself doesn't disprove that there were any priestly additions that entered the Torah. But when you look at portions like that, you have to admit that some of them already existed, and the earlier ascription to them of being later dated just simply doesn't make sense. It makes simple dating by content a very suspect idea. You cannot know that because they use this name of God or because they have this kind of developed content that it comes from earlier or later. And that's one of the bases of the JEDP theory. Now, on these bases, although each was briefly treated, in place of a longer and more full set of examples, I want to submit that the case for Moses as the author of the Torah is not inconsequential. It is upheld with evidence found within the biblical text, but it's also supported by a number of external considerations that are absolutely well worth considering. There's a lot more here, and it seems intellectually unfair to simply rule out Moses as the writer based on Wellhausen's theory that has been very well challenged over time. Just because it's long accepted in a scholarly community does not mean it's right. Ask Copernicus.